attention in terms of media, in terms of politic. And I actually think it makes you need a crisis, unfortunately, in order to make change. That's kind of a human universal. As long as everybody gets what they want on all sides, and there's no real motivation to change, even as a victim or as a perpetrator, it's only when the crisis comes to bear, where people's conflicting needs and desires really come to bear in conflict, that you can work toward a solution, and hopefully a just one, where everyone gets what they're rightly due. So I look at this, and the situation with George Floyd, the situation with Ahmaud Arbery, or with Breonna, these things have been happening for so long. That's not like, oh my gosh, look what happened in Minnesota. It's almost like, oh my gosh, look at how many people care now. It's like this, that's honestly the first base that I come from. So circling all the way back, that's my trepidation really with today. I don't want to just riff on my own opinions. I'm happy to do it, but I really want to know, where you all are, and where are the real questions, where are the real conflicts in this issue. I'm as direct a person as you'll ever get without being rude. I would rather have crap on the table than smell it under a bucket somewhere. So there are real questions about race in our country right now that people are afraid to ask, or they're too angry. They're too, fear of retribution on one side, frustration, anger on the other. So people are swollen. And when people are swollen, we're not necessarily in a mode of solution based. So we need to acknowledge that, but also can't say, well, let's wait till we're not swollen and the crisis is over and then we'll have a discussion. That'll never happen. So we're going to have to find a way to dialogue here in an honest way. And I can speak for myself. I'm not your Black experience, as we used to say. Don't think Damon says so everything's right. But as far as I'm concerned, in this dialogue, there is nothing that can be asked that will offend me. There's nothing that I don't cancel people. I hate the cancel culture. I hate it because it's counterproductive. If you got something stupid to say, I'd rather hear you say it than continue operating under it. If you're confused about something or you're hurt about something, every psychologist and therapist in the world will tell you, feel your feelings and share them. Anything out of the limbic system of the brain or the prefrontal cortex, reasoning it, whatever it is, you got to get it out in order to process it. So I begin with a base, genuine respect for you, for all of you and each of you and what you do. And there's no sensitivity here. There's no sense of, ideology that I'm protecting. It honestly is, I take your question and invitation at its face value until proven otherwise. And you all are rightly concerned about how you personally and ministerially respond to the race questions in your particular ministry. And I'm happy to be part of the dialogue and share, my experience about what it means to live as a Black Catholic, and the voices, the approach, the tone, the questions, and just the reality. I mean, I think probably the one thing, and I'll end on this and hopefully open up to the floor here, is that, operating as a Black man, a Black Catholic man, is a different universe within a universe. And it's not unique to us. I think if you asked any person who, intersects with the broader culture, there are things that you learn to repress. There's things you learn to navigate. Learns to work around in order to, to thrive and to flourish. There's fears, there's memory, good and bad. And you learn, especially when you're intelligent, you learn how to navigate a situation, a culture that's not really yours. You navigate your perception of the perception, and you learn over time how to flourish and how to thrive. So when someone opens up and says, why can't you do this? Or why do you do that? You have to open up and understand the entire lived experience about, and I'm being vague here because it's big. I mean, it could be the way we approach school. How was I approached in the 4th grade with Mrs. Day when I'm blowing through the math program and she still won't advance me, right? Or how do I respond? But I like her and she likes me and everything's kind. So, and if I yell and scream about something, in or out of the classroom, whatever, it's received differently than, Mills, my white friend, who yells and screams and gets a different reaction. So you start to learn that, your presence is different, and multiply that times 1,000 in every interaction. And you start to realize this isn't about saying you ought to do this as much as it really is about listening and hearing what it's like, to live in a non-dominant culture, in the dominant culture, before pontificating on public policy or laws or, who should be fired, who should be canceled. It's complex, but I really end on this. It's not that complex to us. It's really not that complex. We have a personal call to holiness, to sanctity. We're called to be Christ. We try to be like Christ. We're 1 Corinthians 12, being one body. We have our faith, and Jesus Christ wrecked everything in terms of trying to figure out how we all could just get along. Jesus wrecked everything. He just says, be me. And to live toward that personal sanctity of being the body of Christ allows us to be unique and unrepeatable, and yet inseparable and interconnected. So Jesus really is the answer. And the question is, how do we be Christ? As we're becoming Christ, how do we invite others to do it in an authentic way? And the saints call that the supernatural outlook, being able to see things through Christ's eyes. And he's not colorblind at all, but he's able to see each as a unique and unrepeatable, but at the same time, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. So that's my vague opening, and I'm happy to take it anywhere you guys want to go.
I'm greatly appreciative of your worldview on this, because there's not a whole lot of people that we could have invited on that has a Catholic perspective, can be objective on that, and then also has the personal perspective as well. I'll start. We'll say this is open for Q&A. If you have a question, type it in the chat box, either privately to me or publicly, or you can unmute yourself and just interrupt. And then if you become obnoxious, I'll mute you. But I'll start with the first question. I think ignorance breeds fear. Fear breeds prejudice and bigotry and things of that nature. You said you want to be objective. I'm like, I'm actually really interested in you being personal. Like from your, the Catholic perspective, the African-American man perspective, what's going on right now? Because I think for a lot of us, as a white man, I don't see racism on my day in, day out life. It's not even in the back of my mind. And then you see this whole thing blow up. And I'm not ignorant enough to say, oh, I didn't see any of this coming, but I think a lot of us might look on the TV and there's reaction to the looting and the violent protests and the peaceful protests and the police. Like, if you were to put like a summary of here's the different things that are at play right now, and some things that I think that we're not aware of. I mean, let's get the ignorance out of the way in the beginning. Like, what's your perspective on what's going on right now?
Yeah, Everett, well posited here. So without a doubt, we're seeing a confluence, an intersection of agendas, of ideologies, of organizations, and it's a flashpoint. So this isn't a monolithic movement, if it is a movement yet. It's not at all a monolithic movement. There are opportunists. There are folks who have been in this space for a long time. There are class issues. There are economic issues. There are policing issues. There's history at stake here. Some of you may have seen, there's in the public eye, there's some polarities happening, right? You're seeing sort of corporate America jumping on, we're with you and we're throwing money at this and that. And I'm not judging that at all, just observing it. You see some of the Hollywood types who are, almost like, doing their kneel penance walk down like in Fatima, to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. You've got, Dave Chappelle's come out now and he's just throwing fire bombs at everybody. And he's actually one of my favorite comedians too. But, you got to filter a whole lot of stuff through him to hold him up. But he's making good points when you can get through, the vulgarity. You've got, conservatives like Candace Owens who are posting things that are getting really popular about. And so there's what the confluence in my mind is, in this moment, we really can't see all the moving parts and the factors, but I can tell you that what's being portrayed is not monolithic. The peaceful protests are for real. The protests are grassroots. This is not manipulated. It's not anti-Trump. It's not, those are real. Now, mixed into that, you have organizations like a Black Lives Matter who've been, pushing this for 5 years now in terms of police brutality. Love them, hate them, but they're part of that. They're part of that mix. But they could not have put this on. They don't have that kind of juice. They just don't. So it was very much spontaneous. But then opportunists, they were there. People come into their space. Now they become sort of a poster. Far, far, far more people subscribe to the slogan than the movement. So I would disabuse sort of people saying Black Lives Matter, saying, I'm a subscriber to the organization. I think very few people even know who the organization is. They just they see it as a slogan that's true. And like all slogans, they make one point and they miss 5 others. And you have to presume good in order to hear the slogan. So Black Lives Matter does not mean only Black Lives Matter, where some people hear that. Only Black Lives Matter. That's ridiculous. And people say, well, all lives matter. Well, yeah, that's the other part of it. Black lives matter because all lives matter. So they'll say, well, why are you focusing just on Black Lives Matter? Well, because there have been specific attacks on Black lives that seem to indicate that the value of Black lives are less than others. So if you follow with good heart to see where the slogan comes from, there's a lot of truth to it. If you try to poke at it to try to find out where it's got flaws, you're always going to find them. It's true with every movement. So it's a bit of a cop-out, mostly white, some Black, to say Black Lives Matter is distorting it. All lives matter. Can't we all just get along? Well, there are realities in the history of Black America that allow us to see things differently than those who haven't experienced it. So, a policeman who comes in and, abuses his power in an objective way, but does it on a daily basis in one community, doesn't do it in the other, we have a different perspective of the police. And I say we, because even coming from rural New Jersey, my experience has confirmed that. So I know this personally. I know what it's like to drive through, Mendham, New Jersey on a regular basis, ever having been, one time being elected mayor for a day of Mendham, right? And then expecting nearly every night to be pulled over by usually the same police because of my car. That happened for 2 years. So it's one of those things where you're like, don't tell me this doesn't happen. Don't tell me this doesn't. And these are just bad apples. Yeah, they are bad apples, but you can't have it both ways in terms of police brutality. You can't say the blue shield. You attack one police officer, you attack all of law enforcement, and then say, oh yeah, but we have a few bad apples. You're gonna have to pick and choose here. Either there's a monolith that, a striking against one police officer is a strike against the whole state and the nation, or a recognition that one bad police officer, who who he is. Let's not pretend like, the cops will tell you on anyone around a beer, they know who the guys are. They're just out there to crack skulls. They have a militaristic mentality. They know who these guys are, but they wouldn't dare say anything for retribution. So there's nothing that's being said here that's not unknown. I would say from a personal experience, because you asked that personally, I would say that when we look, we have to take everything with we cannot believe anything. I don't care if you're MSNBC or Fox News. I don't care if you're CNN or, Drudge. I don't care where you're getting your news from. Everybody has got an agenda. So you're going to look at a situation and you're going to pick 4 or 5 factual points that you're rock solid factual, and you'll be factual, but those 5 things do not paint the picture, because you need to look at the conflicting, the contradiction, the things that speak against to get the whole picture. And here's the reality. Black America has a history with America. So we receive these things very differently. So don't talk to me about incarceration rates. Don't talk to me about violent crimes, Black on Black. You know that better than anybody. Talk to me about why the police system in our history has always been used against us. And I mean that. This is historical. Right after Abraham Lincoln freed slaves, when people think that was the end of slavery, it's a joke, went into a new era where the only exception to the freedom, the manumission, the freedom of the African slaves was if you commit a crime. And you watch the years, particularly the 15 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the incarceration rates of free Black people. They created a whole system under the penal system that was basically free labor. The whole Jim Crow era after this. So there was a pivot where law enforcement from the beginning was used against African Americans. Now, I'm not from 1870. I'm not from 1868. You're like, what? We can't, get into the modern. Listen, there is genetic and there is historical memory. And the memory is when it gets reinforced. Ask any, and I don't want to do. It's always dangerous doing analogs, but anyone who has been abused, sexual abuse, spousal abuse, child abuse, abuse by a priest, the symbols trigger. The symbols, it's very easy to affirm the symbols. You can find the best priest in the world who's wearing a cassock. And if it reminds someone of being abused in 1964, they're going to have a very different reaction than someone who has had most of us, who've had good interactions with our priest and see the cassock and we go, oh, that's manly. That's a different reaction. So we can't tell someone that their reaction is wrong, especially if we have no attention to that history. And that's my beef with like the Candace Owenses, if you're not familiar with her. It's like everything she says makes perfect sense. And I wrote this. It makes perfect sense if African Americans came to this country on a cruise ship in 1986. But we came on a slave ship in 1586. So if you want to erase 400 years of history, then yeah, you're right. Let's talk about Black on Black crime. Let's talk about the 40% incarceration, 13% of the population. Let's talk about these. Sure, we can talk about that because it should be self-reliant, bootstrapping, do all these. Absolutely. If you want to erase 350 years of history, which has played into not only identification but also relationship. So that's why she's wrong. She's factually. And I go after her because, everybody seems to hold her up in white America. Like, look what this Black person's saying. It must be true. Now we don't have to deal with race. It's just a bunch of criminals. You know what? This is where it gets muddy. And this is where, I lose my grace here. The supernatural view, we have a people whose history with the country has been one of exploitation from day one. And if we think in public school terms, and I'm just in terms of history book terms, that once upon a time there was slavery, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and there's no more slaves. Once upon a time there was Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. King was shot by the last known racists. And Malcolm X just didn't need to be so mean about it. He said some good things, but and then we had affirmative action and the war on poverty. So I don't know what the problem is because there's more Black women in college than there was ever before. Sort of this mentality that, just get over it. I wept and I nearly vomited watching this 8 minutes and 46 seconds, watching that George Floyd thing. So don't talk to me about, yeah, it was bad. He deserves justice. But what an outrage with the looters. Listen, those looters were not part of the march. And you'd have to brainwash yourself to think that somebody is walking through preaching, I am a man, I can't breathe, and then putting that down at night and go stealing a cheesecake from the Cheesecake Factory. I mean, those aren't the same people. They're not the same people.
I'll say this real quick about something that somebody brought to my attention that really enlightened me is that my brother's a military veteran, and when Colin Kaepernick, for example, knelt during the national anthem and that became a thing in the NFL, there was a lot of outrage about it, like disrespect to the flag and disrespect to our military, and I was totally on board with that for the most part. And then we had the George Floyd incident, which is one of a long string of violent attacks on Black men, and there was violent protests in and among the many, many peaceful protests. And somebody pointed out, I was like, man, it's awful that there's this violent protest happening. And they're like, well, we tried peaceful protesting during the national anthem and people objected to that. So what's the next reaction going to be? And I was like, I didn't really think about that. It's like, if you're not peacefully protesting in the right way, then there's outrage. And then, what's going to breed from that? Just more and more frustration, which then leads to apparently you didn't pay attention to us when we were peacefully protesting, so we need to make a big, and then in among all that you have the pandemic, and there's a lot of tension and frustration. We have a question that came in, and I think it's a great question. First, they asked if we're recording this, and we are, because they want to share it with people. But they said, and I don't know so much that this is a question, but it's kind of a statement with a question within a statement. This person has requested several times a prayer service or something for everything going on in our city, but they're being ignored by their priests and deacons in their parish, or they're not getting much traction there. How would you, I guess, approach your parish priests and deacons if you're not getting their attention with regards to what's going on, and really like broach this with them in terms of the importance of doing something to pray for peace and to bring people together?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I think of different factors as well. I mean, it's often hard to get anything scheduled through parishes. So, I mean, in terms of calendar, in terms of priority, in terms of, whatever the dynamics are at your parish, that's not an excuse. It's just a realization that it's not just the race. There may be some particular hesitance and some particular resistance to weighing in at all. And there's fear involved in that. There's fear of doing it wrong, fear of being humiliated or of chastised. I mean, the whole litany of humility, if you want to go through it, that if you do this, you do something public and you do it wrong, you're going to get canceled. And it's one of those things you have to weigh that against the perceived value of doing it. So if everything, as I said in the beginning, if everything is working and there's no crisis in your life, why would you take a risk? So first of it is that there's an awareness that says there's something going on here that's worth taking a risk, and the reward is greater than the risk. So if you're not uncomfortable, if people aren't, demanding this, if you've got two people who are asking for a whole parish event and nobody else, the pastor's going to weigh that against his own interest, his own desires, and the rest of the asks that are happening around. So I think it's a matter of priority. And I think it may be, this is where we get into more, of the raw political sense of having a coalition, an influence large enough that says, look, I've got 40 people who want to pray for peace. Which deacon is going to be available if you're not available, Father? And if not, St. Pat's down the street is going to do it, but you've got 40 parishioners here who are looking to do it. It's personal relationship. I mean, we're getting into ecclesiology. How do you view the pastor? Is he the CEO of your parish? Is he, a father figure? What's your relationship? Is he the distributor of, resources? And there's a whole lot going on here, and you can't just ignore that when you say, I went to my pastor and he said no. So to be honest, we have to press through all of those challenges and our own fears about stepping out with something that we're not confident with. Does it have to be the black person in the parish who now has to get up and say, let's have a racial reconciliation? Is it the white ally? Is it I don't know. But I'm saying each one of those carries with it its own weight of influence. But in the end, I think what we're seeing here is that there's a whole lot of people who care about this, and taking that supernatural approach that is a sincere intercession to the Lord, to bring us the courage to bring a supernatural perspective. And we have to start with ourselves. I think that prayer and reconciliation is essential right now for us. Not like a big public event where you have famous people saying famous words. I mean, real intercession. Lord, help me to see the racism in my heart. Let me see the subtlety. Give me the peace to be able to absorb the evil, the ugly, so it doesn't get recirculated into the, into the atmosphere. That kind of prayer of reconciliation, softening hearts. So I'm not good at the political side in terms of how do I influence my pastor, but I can tell you, as you probably already know, there are many ways to influence, good and bad. And I think getting a coalition of people who really want to pray, then pray. It doesn't have to be liturgical in the capital L sense. It doesn't have to be clerical in any sense. You get 20, 30 people to go in and pray for peace. Church is open. We're going to have a prayer service at 3:00, divine mercy intercession. This is where we're going to do it on Tuesday. We're going to do it on Thursday. Who wants to come? That's not being rebellious. It's not being, but it's also not, Father, can we pray? I mean,
we have actually a great follow-up question from another youth minister who says, how would you direct a prayer event like this with youth? It is obviously on their minds and hearts. Are there any specific approaches you would take with this age group?
Yeah.
Which I know working with youth is not your, I mean, you have 8 kids. You work with youth all the time. So
I'm a de facto youth minister.
You got your own youth group going at home.
Yeah, but I don't have to deal with the parents.
Yeah.
You guys have to deal with the parents. I am the parent. I think if I had to craft something on the fly here, which I would delight in doing, I would say that it's a safe place where, our young people, and I'm thinking, 12, 13 to 18, right? They're forming opinions. They have ideals. They've been talked a lot about the virtues and about the sacramental preparation and all those things. But where's the place that they can vent, where they can, what do you think? What are you afraid to say? You're going to get stuff all over the map, and it's going to tick you off. It's going to delight you. It's going to be blah. And if we could find a way to, safe in the sense of speak your mind, nothing is meant to be repressed. Let's work these things out right, in front of the Lord, but then appeal to the supernatural perspective. Okay, that's it. Now that's how the world thinks. Now, what do we believe as believers in Jesus Christ? What do we think is the solution to this? Because no law is going to change somebody's heart. No public policy is going to change an opinion. No, $10 million to this organization is going to change somebody's perspective or fear that wells right up without thinking about it when a big black man walks down the street in the same. I mean, there's things that are most things are way out of the realm. So what can we do, young people, that really can change heart? And you don't want just sophistry. You don't want, the kids are going to say what you want them to say. But I think a service that helps all of us form a supernatural perspective, that if it wasn't race, it would be some other sin that we're called to bring reconciliation to God with. But it is race. So let's talk about this, and what does it take? Let's really move so that we can not just say, oh, racism is stupid, but it be visceral. Like, this is stupid. Somehow somebody's race is a determinant of who they are, their value, and their place in society. It's just, so I think the young people, their energy, far from repressing it or trying to cap it, I think we'll unleash it in that forum and then help to direct it for a supernatural perspective. Those would be the pillars I'd start with.
Great answer. I always say, if you want to, one of the reasons why I love working with young people is that if you want to start a revolution, you work with young people. That's why John Paul II started World Youth Day.
Yeah.
So it's why Hitler started Hitler Youth Camps. It's because he understood if you control the young people, you control the revolution. Yeah. So, it's why I love working with young people, because if we want to start a revolution for the gospel in our world, do it with young people. They're the ones who are radical.
Well, we can redeem all of that, right? The zeal, power, the idealism, the radicalism, and radix is to the root. Let's get back to the root. All right, let's burn. So let's burn everything down. Let's okay, what happened? Burn it down. Then what? Well, then we'll build something great. Well, then what? Well, somebody disagrees with you. Well, they'll burn it down. So let's walk through. Let's be swollen, but let's talk through how love conquers hate. It's not just a sophistry. It's not just a phrase, but water ends fires, not another fire. Let's help them to use that, as opposed to, that would be a delight. And I'd lean on you all with the expert with them how to do it. But that one, I think, is a way of saying they're relevant. It is firming to their zeal. It's activating the faith. It's not just for sacramental prep. And it's not just to show up on Saturday, but this is relevant. We got to talk about this. And guess what? You have a particular role that you may not be hearing in the news or through your social media feed. You have a particular role because you're Catholic. And here's what this might look like. That would be exciting.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that. We got about 10 minutes left with Damon. You guys don't be shy with your questions. I mean, he even said there's no bad question at this point. If there's something that you want to know with regards to racism, I'll ask you while I'm still waiting for questions to come in. Anecdotally, as a person who's never been pulled over, because time and again, I mean, what was your experience of being pulled over as a young man? Because you mentioned it, you were pulled over every day for 2 years, and I'm like, and in my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh, are you? I mean, it doesn't surprise me because I know what the testimonies have been, but that has not been ever my experience because that's not something I have to deal with. Like, what is the everyday life of an African American young man like in regards to how they deal with law enforcement?
Yeah. First of all, I hate the idea of even being perceived as a victim. If you know me personally, I don't play victim at all, even when I am genuinely one. But here's how it starts, right? So grew up first black family in this town in New Jersey. No big deal as a kid, 4th grade, 3rd grade. My dad's from North Carolina, Asheville. His dad, my granddad, was a preacher, Methodist, and worked at the Biltmore House, right? But the big, gazillionaire built, blanking on the name, but the Biltmore House, right? My mother's from Florida, and via Kingston, Jamaica. So growing up, first of all, I hear the stories before I could drive. Granddaddy, he worked this, and he'd make enough money, and he'd get a new car, but he couldn't drive the car to work because if anybody ever saw him with that car, he would he'd probably lose his job. So he'd have to park his car, 6 blocks away, somewhere to walk and then get there. These are stories just growing up. And my dad would laugh about him. He wasn't like, red or face. He was like, man, you don't know what it was like. He says, so we'd be all in the car, and Daddy would get this, and we'd pull the car over. And so then we go to church, and he drive the car to church. And, my dad's one of like 13. So I have the car full of, new car full of people dressed to nines, ties, hat, everything. And he said, I remember one time we were driving to whatever, and we're not their church, we're another church. And the lights go on. Woo, woo, woo. My dad's a drama teacher, telling stories. So we knew that, and everybody just shut up because Daddy told us whenever that happens, you just be quiet. So and he said, my dad was, he could be mean. He was a tough dude. But when that window rolled down and that policeman came over, yes, sir. How can I help you, sir? Sorry, sir. What can I do for you, sir? I mean, you go into the whole, boy, you know how fast you were driving? I didn't expect that. Hold on.
Oh, you're fine.
My dad used to tell a story about how preacher, strong man, how he would just flip because he had to when the police came. Because even one sense of any kind of pride, without talking back, if you had sort of that pride, they will find something. They will find, and my dad would say, well, he said they would never find you. So these are the story of my dad. So by the time I'm ready to drive, he's giving me the talk. And every black family gets the talk. The talk is, this is what you do when the police pull you over. And it's just that whole new level of just accepting and humiliation and knowing that whatever you do, it's wrong. The line was, when you're white, you're right. When you're brown, stick around. But if you're black, get back. I mean, that's how they joked about it in the community, right? So 2 hands, 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. This down, light on. Don't make any move. Don't make, not even sunny moves. Don't make any move. Even when they say license registration. So it's in the glove compartment right here. I'm just going to reach over and get it. and you make sure, and even then so there's a whole routine that we're taught. And the story that I told about just getting pulled over, it wasn't violent. It was never violent. It was just humiliating. Now at this time, I went to Brown up in Rhode Island, so I had a little juice, like, I'm an Ivy League school, so I'm sure they'll treat me differently because I've got degrees, I've got all this, no, it doesn't. I was driving a nice car. I think I got like a used, Audi 4000 black with like black tinted windows and red leather seats, and I mean it was hot. This is like 1989, before I went to Berkeley. And I'd go through from my town, this other town, and there's always this little speed trap. And every time I went through this town, I was actually a singer. So I was in New York. So I go in Manhattan 4 nights a week, doing different clubs and singing and things like that. So I get home 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. That's the context. It wasn't just like driving through town at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, that's that. But in a nice car, and they all knew who I was. A small town, and still, if I was out 4 nights a week, I get pulled over twice. And the other 2 nights, I'm waiting to get pulled over. So it's not like it's a free night. It's just, you just happen to pass through town. You're like, all right, I guess I got through. Otherwise it's woo. Now, mind you, these are the towns where some of these police officers were my football coaches. It wasn't like it was, I was an unknown in some, urban situation. That kind of stuff it's just humiliating. So what do? I drive everywhere I go, and I expect to get pulled over, or not get such a nice car. So, Everett, I forgot your original question, but I'm sorry.
No. That's kind of it gives perspective because I actually asked you. I said anecdotally, so which means tell me a story, and that's exactly what you did. And I know you were willing to go to a place where you're vulnerable, and it for someone who hasn't lived in that reality, it's, I think, essential, because it's one of these things where it's like, look, ignorance breeds fear, fear breeds prejudice. We're ignorant of what it is like to grow up in such a way. Because these kinds of things, for a young black man, for example, where we might minister to somebody in our youth group, the fact that they grow up in a case where they're afraid to drive for fear of being humiliated, that can affect their identity, that can affect their trust, that can affect their relationship with God, their relationship with
Absolutely.
others. I mean, and it's a place where we need to be able to go from a ministry perspective. We have a few more minutes with you, and one more question that came in. It said, so how do we build trust? If it takes supernatural, how do we navigate the culture that increasingly denies God in the public square? Well, that's a big question for 4 minutes left on our
But
call.
it's the right question. It's the right question, in my opinion. So, I'm telling you the stories that, and like in anyone's history, it only takes a few negative formational situations that becomes the narrative all the way through. I don't feel oppression in my life. I feel mostly joy in my life. Anybody who knows me, and it's genuine. But I've also learned how to navigate situations that I have been taught are more dangerous for me than other people. And I think getting into that level is way past public policy. It's way past, corporate this or laws. It's precisely in our realm. This is how we live it. This is how we do this. We build friendships, and the friendships break narratives. The biggest shock I had for me wasn't even in America. I did a tour down in Johannesburg, South Africa. I think it was 2015. I was there for about 10 days, 12 days, and I was giving talks, around the diocese there and a couple of other townships. And I could not process the race relations in Johannesburg as an African American, where they were such friendships, there was such tribalism. Skin color had nothing to do with it. I mean, in America, it's always skin tone, right? Paper bag test, whether or not you can pass. It's all about color. Nobody cares where you come from. When you go to some of these African countries, man, they can look at you and tell you what country you're from, what tribe you're from, and they're like, oh, those Zimbabweans. Oh, you gotta watch out for those Eritreans. You gotta watch out. And I'm looking around like, they all look black to me, or the deep bond of friendships of, the Afrikaner, the white host who who to their soul consider themselves African. And who am I to question that? So we're African. There's a lot of this very specific to the United States, the racism, very specific. And recognizing that it was slavery that came first. Racism was used to support slavery. So it's very important to know that. Slavery didn't happen because of racism. Slavery is as old as humanity. You look at the slave trade prior to the 1500s, it had very little to do with skin color. It had to do with congregation, right? But since then, and probably 100 years in, racism, whether it's scientific racism, whether it's institutional racism, whether it's law and legislation, that's all the stuff that had to prop up the slave system. So once the formal slave system ended and a de facto one came, the racism still holds up, benefiting one over the other. That's why it's stupid. There's nothing objective about it. It's completely subjective. So for me, to answer your question, I think it's about really, a humility and recognizing you can't immediately process the situation just from your own perspective. Like I couldn't do it in South Africa. I had to ask my Afrikaner host, and she was almost indignant about how he's like, that's such an American. It's like, no, this is Umbatu. She's my best friend, and we grew up together. And so it's not color. Imagine a racism that had nothing to do with color. That still boggles my mind. But we have been trained in the U.S. that race is really about color, and we ignore class, we ignore finance, we ignore the residual effects of that propping up over the centuries, which has to do with the policing. It has to do with victimhood. It has to do with violence. It has to do with fatherless homes. And I'll end my little rant here with this. In a very real way, this is the work that I do. Whether it's with Joy to Be, my previous ministry, the Theology Body Institute, or now with Joyful Ever After, I'm 1,000% convinced that the reordering and the strengthening of marriage to strengthen the family is the current and long-term solution to all of this when it's rooted in Jesus Christ. With that, politics, media, these are all lagging indicators. These aren't leading indicators, right? They mirror and follow what happens. We've got to get our families. We've got to build friendships among couples, among families, and that's what destroys really the sin of racism. At the same time, we look at public policy or institutions that are wrong to prevent evil, absolutely, but no law ever made anybody good.
Amen to that. Damon, real quick, if do you have anything, if people want to get in contact with you, or if they want to read your books? You mentioned your ministries real quick at the end, but here's your merch table opportunity. Plug your merch table.
Yeah, well, my ministry is all based in the theology of the body. We just launched a brand new ministry just February 25th called Joyful Ever After. Getting the marriage you want from the marriage you have. And we just hosted the Catholic Marriage Summit this past weekend. And
which was excellent.
Yeah, 39,000 couples from 50 countries. And we got 25,000 in our Facebook page that are sharing beyond how we can help them right now. And it's just such an affirmation of how we need community. And that's why it came to my mind, that sharing that has to happen person to person, couple to couple, family to family, is so much more powerful than any policy or law. So joyfuleverafter.org is the ministry, and Catholic Marriage Summit is the launch. It just happened this weekend to help couples flourish in marriage.
Wonderful. Thank you, Damon, for being with us today. I know for me this was really enlightening, and I really appreciate that you took the time to share your perspective and your views and your ministry with all the youth ministers from the Diocese of Palm Beach, both those who are on the live call and those who will watch it later via recording.
Thank you, Everett.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to add my thanks.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you.
Damon, thank you so much. I thank you for being raw and honest. I knew you would be. That's why I asked you.
Thank you, Kathy.
I appreciate it. And I'm real excited about your Joyful Ever After. We'll have to talk about that. So
I love it. I'd love to. Thank you. Appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Let's give glory to God.
Thank you,
We'll pray.
Damon.
Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Mm.
All right. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, everyone, until next week.
Thanks.
Thank you all for joining us again.
Right. God bless you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thanks.